Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the opulent, candlelit opera houses and soaring cathedrals of 17th and 18th century Europe, specifically Italy, a world of breathtaking artistry, intense passion, and a peculiar kind of stardom. Imagine yourself seated amidst the rustling silks and powdered wigs of an eager audience. The orchestra swells, and then a voice emerges, a sound so pure, so powerful, so agile, it seems almost otherworldly. It soars to ethereal heights, then cascades down with effortless precision, filling the vast space with a beauty that brings tears to the eyes and a thrill to the soul. This, you are told, is the voice of a castrato, one of the celebrated male sopranos or altos, whose vocal prowess dominated the European musical scene for nearly 2 centuries. They were the superstars of their age, adored by the public, sought after by kings and composers. But as you listen, captivated by this heavenly voice, a disquieting thought begins to prick at the edges of your consciousness. How is such a sound, a man's voice retaining the purity and range of a boy soprano, yet imbued with the power and stamina of an adult's lungs, even possible? The title of our journey tonight, with its stark phrase, brutal childhood sacrifice, has already planted a seed of unease. And that, my friends, is where the devil's bargain of our story lies. For behind the sublime artistry, behind the operatic triumphs, and the ecclesiastical glories, lies a shocking secret, a practice so physically invasive and morally questionable by our standards that it's hard to reconcile with the divine beauty it produced. Tonight's reality check. To achieve that celebrated, almost supernatural vocal quality, these boys, often from impoverished families and chosen for a promising voice between the tender ages of 7 and 12, underwent a surgical procedure, castration, before puberty could change their voices. This medical hardship, this gory history, performed crudely, often secretly, and with enormous risk, was the brutal price paid for that angelic sound. Could you, as a parent, ever make such a choice for your child, even with the promise of fame and fortune? Could you, as a listener, truly separate the beauty of the song from the pain of its creation? It's a deeply uncomfortable, profoundly human dilemma. So, before you get comfortable, before we delve into this world of exquisite sound and excruciating sacrifice, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, do drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always a profound experience to connect with our global community as we embark on these often challenging historical explorations. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We will explore the rise of the Castrati, the reasons for their extraordinary popularity, the nature of the brutal childhood sacrifice that created them, their grueling training, their dazzling careers, the unique physical and psychological landscape they inhabited, and ultimately, the societal shifts that led to their decline and disappearance. This is the story of the Castrati, a tale where the pursuit of artistic perfection led down a path of almost unimaginable human cost. A story that will make you listen to Baroque opera with entirely new ears to understand the emergence of the Castrati, a phenomenon almost unique to Italian music from the late 16th to the early 19th century. You need to first appreciate a peculiar intersection of religious doctrine, social norms, and evolving artistic tastes. The shocking secret behind the initial demand for these surgically altered male singers lies, paradoxically, in the imposed silence of women within certain sacred and public spaces. Imagine yourself in Rome, the heart of the Catholic Church, around the turn of the 17th century. The Pauline injunction, mulieres in ecclesias taceunt, women should keep silent in churches, from 1 Corinthians, was interpreted quite literally by the Vatican. Women were forbidden from singing in church choirs, most notably in the prestigious Sistine Chapel choir. This created a significant musical problem: sacred polyphony, the intricate interweaving of multiple vocal lines that characterized Renaissance and early Baroque church music, absolutely required high voices, sopranos and altos, to complete its rich texture, with women barred, who would sing these crucial upper parts. Initially, the solution involved using boys with unchanged voices. Boy sopranos and altos have a pure, ethereal quality, but their careers in the upper registers are fleeting. Puberty, with its inevitable vocal break, meant a constant turnover of singers and a loss of experienced musicians, just as they were reaching their peak. Another option was the use of male falsettists, particularly from Spain, where there was a strong tradition of adult men singing in a high, false voice. These Spanish falsettists were indeed employed in papal choirs for a time. However, falsetto voices, while capable of reaching high notes, often lacked the power, richness, and tonal flexibility that composers were beginning to demand, especially as music moved towards the more dramatic and expressive styles of the Baroque era. It's in this context that the castrato emerged as a seemingly perfect solution, albeit a morally troubling one. A boy castrated before puberty would retain his high-pitched vocal range indefinitely. His larynx would not undergo the typical male adolescent changes. Yet, as he grew to adulthood, his chest, lungs, and physical stamina would develop to those of a man. The result, vocally, was the best of both worlds. From the perspective of contemporary musical directors, the pure, flute-like timbre and high range of a boy soprano or alto, combined with the lung power, breath control, and sheer vocal athleticism of a mature male singer, you can almost hear the cynical, if pragmatic, calculation. A voice that never breaks, capable of astonishing feats of agility and endurance. The practice seems to have taken root in Italy during the latter half of the 16th century, initially within church choirs. The first documented castrati appeared in the service of the Duke of Ferrara, and by the early 1600s, they were officially admitted into the Sistine Chapel choir, despite papal bulls that theoretically condemned the act of castration for this purpose. One quirky, or rather hypocritical detail is how the Church navigated this. While the act of creating a castrato was a sin and technically illegal, employing one who had already been castrated, often with the fiction that it was due to a medical necessity, like a childhood accident or illness, was apparently permissible. The scholarly debate often centers on the Church's complicity and the ethical gymnastics required to justify this practice. As the new art form of opera exploded in popularity in Italy throughout the 17th century, the demand for castrati skyrocketed. Opera, with its heroic male roles, written for high, brilliant voices, representing gods, heroes, and classical figures, found its ideal interpreters in the castrati. Their unique vocal capabilities allowed composers to write increasingly virtuosic and emotionally charged music. The medical hardship inflicted upon these boys thus became, paradoxically, the foundation for a golden age of operatic singing. The silence of women in church had, through a series of morally ambiguous steps, given rise to a new, extraordinary, and deeply problematic type of male superstar. The soaring voices of the Castrati filled Europe's opera houses and cathedrals, earning them fame, fortune, and the adoration of audiences. But behind this glittering facade of artistic triumph lies a far more somber story, one rooted in the grinding poverty and desperate hopes of countless Italian families during the 17th and 18th centuries. The shocking secret is that the brutal childhood sacrifice mentioned in our title was often not a choice made by the boys themselves, but a desperate gamble taken by their parents, who saw in their son's promising young voice a potential ticket out of a life of unrelenting hardship. Imagine yourself as a peasant farmer or a struggling artisan in a small Italian village. Life is a constant battle for survival. Crop failures, disease, and crushing taxes are ever-present threats. You have many children, and the prospect of providing for them all is daunting. Then, one of your young sons, perhaps 7, 8, or 9 years old, shows a particular aptitude for singing. He has a clear, strong, beautiful voice that turns heads in the local church choir. You hear whispers, tales of boys just like him, who went on to become musicisti, the polite term for castrati, earning vast sums of money, living like princes, supporting their entire families in comfort. The lure is powerful, almost irresistible. It's a lottery, yes, but the potential prize is a life beyond your wildest dreams. The medical hardship here is not just the operation itself, but the agonizing decision that precedes it. You, as a parent, would be wrestling with an unbearable choice. On one hand, there's the love for your child, the natural desire to protect him from harm, and the moral implications of subjecting him to such a mutilating procedure. On the other hand, there's the crushing weight of poverty, the bleak future facing your family, and the dazzling promise of a better life that a successful castrato career could offer. What would you do? Ancient societal norms regarding parental authority and the economic contribution of children were also different. A child was often seen as an asset, and their future might be determined by the family's needs. The decision was often made in consultation with local music teachers, priests, or talent scouts who roamed the countryside looking for promising young voices. These individuals might paint a glowing picture of the fame and fortune awaiting a successful castrato, perhaps downplaying the risks or the lifelong consequences of the operation. There are accounts of parents being offered a sum of money, a desperately needed windfall, in exchange for allowing their son to undergo the procedure and be indentured to a music master. You can almost feel the mixture of hope and dread as the transaction is made, a child's future signed away. One quirky, or rather tragically ironic detail is that because the act of castration for singing was technically illegal and condemned by the church, even as the church employed castrati, the operations were often shrouded in secrecy and euphemism. The official story was almost always that the boy had suffered an accident, a fall from a horse, an attack by a wild boar or dog, or a medical condition like a hernia or a testicular ailment that necessitated the surgery. This fiction was maintained throughout the castrato's life, a collective denial of the brutal reality. The scholarly debate explores the extent to which families were truly deceived, or if they were complicit in this charade out of desperation or ambition. The human endurance required of these families to live with such a decision, and of the boys to embark on this irreversible path, is a central, heartbreaking theme of the castrato story. It was a gamble for gold and glory, a devil's bargain made in the shadows, with a child's body and future as the stake. The path from a village choir boy to a celebrated Castrato superstar was a perilous and highly selective one. Not every boy with a pleasant voice was destined for this extraordinary, if brutal, transformation. There was a process, however informal and often exploitative, for identifying those little singers, putti cantori, whose vocal potential was deemed exceptional enough to warrant the risks and the investment of a castrato's education. As you, the observer, peer into this world, you see a mixture of genuine talent spotting, parental ambition, and the cold calculations of music masters and impresarios. Imagine a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, singing in his local church. His voice is unusually clear, strong and agile for his age. It possesses that certain je ne sais quoi that catches the ear of the local priest, the choir master, or perhaps a traveling musician passing through the village. Word might spread. In an era obsessed with vocal music, a truly promising boy soprano was a valuable commodity, a rough diamond that, with the right and terrible intervention, could be polished into a priceless gem. You can almost feel the stir of excitement and perhaps a dawning uncomfortable awareness among the adults who recognized this potential. These talent scouts, and they were, in effect, scouts, though not for a sports team but for the opera stage and the great choirs, would be looking for specific qualities. Not just a pretty voice, but one with power, range, and an innate musicality. They might test the boy, asking him to sing scales, to hold long notes, to imitate complex melodies. They would assess his general health and intelligence, his capacity for the rigorous training that lay ahead. The medical hardship here, even before the operation, is the intense scrutiny, the pressure placed upon a young child who likely has no real understanding of what this special talent might ultimately cost him. Once a boy was identified as having truly exceptional potential, the negotiations with his family would begin, as we discussed. This wasn't always a straightforward process. Some families, despite their poverty, might resist out of love or moral conviction. Others, swayed by the promise of a better life or pressured by circumstance, would consent. There are accounts of families essentially selling their sons to music masters or patrons who would then fund the boy's castration and subsequent education in return for a share of his future earnings. It was a grim form of indentured servitude, with the boy's body as the collateral. One quirky, or rather tragic detail, is the sheer number of boys who were likely castrated each year in Italy during the peak of the castrato phenomenon in the 17th and 18th centuries. Estimates vary wildly, as the practice was clandestine, but some historians suggest it could have been several thousand annually. Of these, only a tiny fraction would go on to achieve true fame and fortune. The vast majority would end up as mediocre singers in provincial church choirs, or perhaps their voices wouldn't develop as hoped even after the operation, leaving them in a kind of social and physical limbo, their sacrifice ultimately in vain. The scholarly debate often considers the wastage rate and the forgotten lives of these less successful castrati. You try to imagine the emotional state of these little singers. Some, perhaps, were ambitious themselves, captivated by the stories of famous musicians. Others were likely bewildered, frightened, and powerless pawns in the decisions made by the adults around them. The human endurance required just to navigate this initial stage, the identification, the parental decision, the looming dread of the operation, is immense. They were children, their futures being irrevocably altered. their bodies prepared for a sacrifice they could not fully comprehend, all for the promise of a voice that might, just might, enchant an empire. We now arrive at the heart of our story's brutal childhood sacrifice, the act that both created the Castrato's heavenly voice and forever marked his earthly existence. The castration of young boys, typically between the ages of 7 and 12, before their voices broke with puberty, was a clandestine, dangerous, and by any modern standard, horrifying procedure. As you, the unwilling observer of this historical reality, steel yourself, we must peer into the shadows where this medical hardship, this act of profound physical and psychological violence, took place. The operation itself was illegal under both civil and canon, church, law, punishable by excommunication for those performing it and those consenting to it. This meant it was driven underground, performed not by reputable surgeons in established medical facilities, but by a shadowy network of local barbers, who often doubled as crude surgeons, village healers, livestock gelders, or itinerant specialists, whose skills were as dubious as their ethics. You can imagine these operations taking place in even secluded back rooms, remote farmhouses, or dingy inns, far from prying eyes, the air thick with a mixture of fear, desperation, and the cloying scent of whatever crude anesthetics might be used. Anesthesia, as we know it, did not exist. The methods for dulling the unimaginable pain were primitive and often dangerous in themselves. Some accounts suggest the boy might be given large quantities of opium, if available, to induce a stupor. Others describe a more brutal method, compressing the carotid arteries in the neck to cause unconsciousness, a practice fraught with the risk of brain damage or death. Sometimes, the boy might simply be submerged in a very cold bath to numb the area and perhaps reduce bleeding, or given copious amounts of wine or spirits until he was insensible. You try to picture the terror of a young child, held down, perhaps semi-conscious, as the surgeon approached with his unsterilized knife or razor. The surgical procedure itself, or chiectomy, the removal of the testicles, was performed with a haste born of necessity and a shocking lack of anatomical precision or concern for sterile technique. The instruments were basic, a sharp blade, perhaps some thread for ligatures, and little else. The risk of hemorrhage, shock, and overwhelming infection was astronomically high. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory. Post-operative care, if any, would have been rudimentary. The gory history here is not just the act of cutting, but the almost certain agony, the high fever, the festering wounds, and the very real prospect of a slow, painful death that followed for many of these unfortunate boys. The scholarly debate often centers on the true mortality rate associated with the procedure. Because it was illegal and secret, reliable statistics are impossible to obtain. However, given the conditions, the lack of skill of many practitioners, and the absence of effective medical care, it's widely assumed that a significant percentage of boys subjected to castration did not survive, or were left permanently maimed or chronically ill. One quirky, or rather, tragically revealing detail is the euphemisms used. As we noted, the official story was almost always one of accidental injury or necessary medical intervention to save the boy's life from some fictitious ailment, like a hernia, a dog bite, or a fall from a horse. This elaborate charade was maintained to protect all involved, the parents, the practitioners, and even the church officials who would later employ these singers. The human endurance of the boys who did survive this brutal ordeal is almost beyond comprehension. They awoke to a new reality, their bodies irrevocably altered, their childhood stolen, their futures set upon a strange and uncertain path, all for the promise of that heavenly voice. This was the true, terrible price of admission into the glittering, demanding world of the Castrati. The shadowy blade has done its work. The young boy, your imagined self in this historical reconstruction, now lies in the immediate aftermath of the castration, a period fraught with extreme peril, where the line between life and death is terrifyingly thin. The brutal childhood sacrifice is not a single moment of pain, but the beginning of a dangerous and uncertain journey. The shocking secret here is the sheer number of boys who likely did not survive this initial post-operative phase. Their dreams of golden voices and operatic glory extinguished before they even had a chance to sing their first adult note. Imagine the scene. You are lying on a crude bed or pallet, perhaps in the same dimly lit, unhygienic room where the operation took place. The initial stupor induced by opium or near asphyxiation wears off, replaced by waves of agonizing pain. There are no effective analgesics, only perhaps more opium, which carries its own risks, or herbal concoctions of dubious efficacy. The surgical wound itself, inflicted with unsterilized instruments by a practitioner with little understanding of anatomy or infection control, is a breeding ground for disaster. The medical hardship is acute and multifaceted. The primary, immediate risk is hemorrhage. If a blood vessel was not properly ligated, tied off, during the hasty procedure, or if the ligature slips, uncontrolled bleeding could quickly lead to shock and death. You can picture the desperate, often futile attempts by whomever is caring for the boy, perhaps his distraught parents, or the surgeon himself, to staunch the flow of blood, using crude bandages, pressure, or perhaps even applying hot irons or caustic substances to the wound in a misguided attempt at cauterization, only adding to the agony and tissue damage. Then comes the almost inevitable onset of infection. In a world without antibiotics, where even basic hygiene was poorly understood, any surgical wound, especially one inflicted in such clandestine and unsanitary conditions, was an open invitation to bacteria. Within days, the area would likely become swollen, red, intensely painful, and hot to the touch. Fever would set in, a raging fire consuming the boy's small, weakened body. You can almost feel the delirium, the chills, the sweats. Sepsis or blood poisoning was a common and usually fatal consequence. The gory history here is the body's losing battle against an invisible enemy, the putrefaction and decay that could set in, leading to a slow, agonizing demise. The scholarly debate often attempts to estimate the mortality rates, as we've discussed. While precise figures are impossible, anecdotal evidence and general understanding of surgical outcomes in that era suggest they were appallingly high. Some historians propose that for every Farinelli who graced the stages of Europe, there might have been dozens, if not hundreds, of other boys whose names are lost to history, their voices silenced forever by death from hemorrhage or infection in the days and weeks following the operation. This is the hidden cost, the unseen tragedy behind the glittering spectacle of castrato performance. One quirky, or rather, heartbreakingly pragmatic detail is that the families who had made this desperate gamble would often be plunged into even deeper despair if their son died. Not only had they lost a child, but they had also likely incurred debts or exhausted their meager resources in arranging for the operation and the anticipated musical training. The human endurance required of these boys to simply survive the initial trauma, the pain, the fever, the terror, was immense. Those who pulled through, who slowly began to heal, were considered the lucky ones, though their bodies and their futures were now irrevocably altered. They had passed through the first fiery trial, but a lifetime of unique challenges, both physical and psychological, still lay ahead. The young boy, having miraculously survived the immediate, life-threatening dangers of the castration itself, now embarks on a path of physical development profoundly different from that of his uncastrated peers. The brutal childhood sacrifice continues to exact its toll, not in acute pain, but in a lifelong series of physiological alterations that shape his body, his voice, and his very identity. As you, the observer, witness this transformation, you uncover the shocking secrets of how the absence of testosterone sculpts a unique and often challenging human form. The most immediate and intended consequence, of course, is on the voice, because the testicles, the primary source of testosterone in males, were removed before puberty. The boy's larynx, voice box, does not undergo the typical adolescent changes. It remains relatively small and childlike in structure. His vocal cords do not thicken and lengthen as they would in an intact male. This is why his voice retains its high prepubescent pitch, soprano or alto, throughout his adult life. However, this is only part of the story of the castrato voice. While his larynx remains small, the rest of his body continues to grow, often in unusual ways. One of the key medical hardships, or more accurately, physiological peculiarities, is their skeletal development. Testosterone plays a crucial role in signaling the fusion of the epiphyses, the growth plates at the ends of long bones, which stops bone growth. Without this hormonal signal occurring at the normal time, the castrato's long bones in the arms and legs often continue to grow for a longer period than usual. This could result in individuals who were unusually tall, with disproportionately long limbs and fingers. You might picture them, a striking, somewhat unsettling figure on the opera stage. Furthermore, their rib cages often became exceptionally large and well-developed, partly due to this altered bone growth, and partly due to the intensive respiratory training they underwent. This gave them an enormous lung capacity and breath control, a key component of their vocal power and endurance. Other physical characteristics also emerged. They typically did not develop significant facial or body hair. Their skin might remain softer, and they often had a tendency to accumulate subcutaneous fat, particularly around the hips, buttocks, and chest, sometimes leading to a somewhat androgynous or even feminine appearance, especially as they aged. This could be a source of ridicule or social awkwardness. The scholarly debate considers the extent to which these physical traits contributed to their unique stage presence, and the often exotic or otherworldly perception audiences had of them. One quirky, yet significant lifelong health concern for Castrati was an increased risk of osteoporosis and other bone density problems in later life due to the chronic lack of testosterone. While their voices might have seemed eternally youthful, their skeletons could become prematurely fragile. You can imagine the human endurance required to live with a body that was, in many ways, a medical marvel and a physiological anomaly, a constant reminder of the sacrifice made in childhood. They were, in a sense, a third gender in the eyes of society, neither fully male in the conventional sense, nor female, occupying a unique and often ambiguous space. Their physical form, so essential to their unique artistry, was also a permanent visible testament to the shocking secret of their creation, a body transformed by the shadowy blade in pursuit of a heavenly voice. The young boy, his body now set on its unique path of development, post-castration. If he showed continued vocal promise and was fortunate enough to have a patron or a family with connections, would typically be sent to one of the famous music conservatories, particularly those in Naples, which became the epicenter of castrato training in the 17th and 18th centuries. Here, amidst a hothouse atmosphere of intense competition and relentless discipline, the heavenly voice was not just preserved, but meticulously forged through years of grueling, all-consuming labor. You are about to step inside one of these legendary, if unforgiving, institutions. Imagine a large, bustling building, echoing with the sounds of scales, arpeggios, and complex vocal exercises, often from dawn till dusk. These weren't called conservatories because they conserved music in the modern sense, but because they originally conserved, cared for, and educated orphans and poor children, many of whom were groomed for musical careers. For a young castrato, life here was a strict, almost monastic regime, dedicated entirely to the cultivation of his voice and musical talent. The human endurance required was not just physical, but mental and emotional. The daily schedule was punishing. Lessons would begin early, often before sunrise, and continue late into the evening with only brief breaks for meals and prayer. You'd see your young self, or a boy in your care, spending hours each day on solfeggio, sight singing and ear training, mastering scales and intervals until they were second nature. Then came endless vocal exercises, gorgegi, rapid, agile vocal runs, drilly, trills, basagi, virtuosic passages, designed to develop that legendary castrato, agility, flexibility, and breath control. The famed music master, Nicola Porpora, who taught Farinelli and Caffarelli, among others, was known for his incredibly demanding training methods, sometimes keeping a student on a single page of exercises for years until it was perfected. Beyond vocal technique, the training was comprehensive. The boys studied music theory, harmony, counterpoint, and composition. They learned to play keyboard instruments like the harpsichord, essential for understanding harmony and accompanying themselves. They were taught literature, poetry, and stagecraft, preparing them for the dramatic demands of opera. The medical hardship here wasn't from a surgeon's knife, but from the sheer, relentless strain of this intensive training on a young body and mind. Burnout, vocal damage from over-practicing, and the psychological stress of constant competition were very real risks. One quirky, or rather telling detail is the intense rivalry that often existed between students, and later, between established castrati. The stakes were incredibly high. A successful career meant unimaginable fame and fortune, while failure could mean a life of obscurity and poverty, their childhood sacrifice rendered tragically pointless. This competitive pressure would have been a constant motivator and a source of immense anxiety. The scholarly debate often considers the pedagogical methods of these conservatories. Were they nurturing talent, or ruthlessly molding human instruments through a process that bordered on abuse? The shocking secret is that these institutions, while producing some of the most technically brilliant singers the world has ever known, were also places of immense pressure and almost factory-like production. The boys were investments, their voices commodities. Yet it was within these demanding, often Spartan walls that the raw potential created by that brutal childhood sacrifice was honed into the sublime artistry that would captivate Europe. The heavenly voice was not a gift lightly received. It was forged in a crucible of sweat, tears, and an almost superhuman dedication to a singular, all-consuming craft. You've witnessed the brutal sacrifice, the perilous aftermath, and the grueling training that shaped the Castrato. Now, let's try to comprehend the shocking secret of what made their voices so extraordinary, so seemingly miraculous to contemporary ears that societies were willing to condone and even celebrate the practice that created them. The Castrato voice was a unique physiological and acoustic phenomenon, a combination of childlike purity and adult power that has no true equivalent today. The fundamental basis, as we've established, was the prepubertal castration, which prevented the larynx or voice box from enlarging and the vocal cords from thickening and lengthening as they normally would during male adolescence. This meant the Castrato retained the high vocal range of a boy soprano or alto throughout his life. But this alone doesn't explain the magic. Many boys sing beautifully. What set the Castrati apart was what happened after that point, combined with their unique physical development and intensive training. While their larynx remained small, their thoracic cavity, their chest and lungs, developed to adult male proportions, often becoming exceptionally large and powerful due to years of specialized breathing exercises. This gave them an almost superhuman lung capacity and breath control. Imagine a singer able to sustain a single note, swelling it from a whisper to a roar and back again for an astonishing length of time, or to sing incredibly long, complex musical phrases known as coloratura, seemingly without ever needing to take a breath. This was a hallmark of the great Castrati, a feat that left audiences breathless themselves. The human endurance was not just in their lives, but in their very vocal production. This combination of a small, flexible larynx like a child's, with the powerful respiratory system of an adult male, and then some, resulted in a voice of unparalleled characteristics, range. They could typically sing across 3 octaves or more, encompassing both soprano and alto registers, with ease, sometimes even dipping into tenor notes. Power. Despite the high pitch, their voices were not thin or reedy. They possessed immense volume and carrying power, capable of filling the largest opera houses and cathedrals of the era, often without the aid of modern acoustics or amplification. They could dominate an orchestra. Agility and flexibility. Their small vocal cords allowed for incredible speed, precision, and agility in executing rapid scales, trills, arpeggios, and complex ornamentation. Composers wrote music of dazzling technical difficulty specifically to showcase this virtuosity, timbre, tone quality. This is perhaps the hardest aspect to reconstruct. Contemporaries described it as angelic, heavenly, flute-like, silvery, pure, yet also capable of intense dramatic expression and pathos. It was said to possess a unique, ethereal, almost sexless beauty that was profoundly moving. One quirky tidbit: some castrati were even said to be able to vocally duel with instruments like trumpets or oboes, matching their brilliance and agility, a popular trope in Baroque opera arias. The scholarly debate often revolves around trying to understand the precise acoustic properties of their voices from historical descriptions, as the single surviving recording of Alessandro Moreschi, made in the early 20th century, when he was past his prime and the recording technology primitive, is considered by many to be an imperfect representation of the castrato voice in its golden age. The medical hardship of their creation was, in a cruel irony, the very source of this miracle sound. A sound that captivated Europe for generations. A sound that, in its truest form, is now lost to time, existing only in written accounts and the challenging music composed for it. To truly grasp the phenomenon of the castrati and the shocking secret of their immense fame and influence, we must look at the lives of its brightest stars. And no star shone more brilliantly, no voice was more legendary than that of Carlo Broschi, known to a captivated Europe simply as Farinelli. His story, a dazzling ascent from a boy subjected to the brutal childhood sacrifice to a near mythical figure adored by royalty and commoners alike, encapsulates both the glory and the strangeness of the castrato age. Born in 1705 in Puglia, Italy, young Carlo's prodigious vocal talent was recognized early. Like so many others, he underwent the irreversible operation, the medical hardship that would preserve his extraordinary boy soprano voice around the age of 7 or 8. His training was likely with the renowned Nicola Porpora in Naples, one of an entire generation of boys whose families gambled their sons' futures on the operating table. You can imagine him, a child, enduring the grueling discipline of the conservatory, his life dedicated to perfecting an instrument created through such a profound physical alteration. Farinelli's debut in Rome in 1722, at the age of 17, was a sensation. His voice was described as possessing unparalleled beauty, power, agility, and an astonishing range that reportedly spanned over 3.5 octaves. He could execute the most difficult coloratura passages with breathtaking ease, sustain notes for incredible lengths, and move audiences to tears with the pathos of his delivery. He quickly became the most famous singer in Italy, then conquered Vienna, London, Paris, and Madrid. Composers like Hasse, Porpora, and his own brother Riccardo Broschi wrote operas specifically to showcase his phenomenal abilities. You are there in a packed London opera house as Farinelli unleashes a cascade of perfectly placed notes, a sound so pure and powerful it seems to transcend human capability. The audience is in a frenzy, women swoon, men weep. This is the power of a castrato superstar. One of the most famous and quirky episodes in Farinelli's life was his time in Spain, from 1737 to 1759. He was summoned to the court of King Philip V, who was suffering from severe depression, melancholia. Legend has it that Farinelli's singing was the only thing that could soothe the king's troubled mind. For nearly a decade, Farinelli reportedly sang the same 4 or 5 arias to Philip V every single night, a private concert that became a crucial part of the king's therapy. This extraordinary routine continued under Philip's successor, Ferdinand VI. Farinelli became not just a court singer, but a powerful royal favorite, wielding considerable political influence, organizing court entertainments, and amassing a great fortune The human endurance of this nightly, unvarying performance for years on end is a testament to his professionalism and perhaps his unique relationship with the Spanish monarchs. The scholarly debate often considers the nature of Farinelli's power. Was it purely his voice, or also his intelligence, charm, and diplomatic skill? He was by all accounts a well-educated, cultivated man. Yet despite his fame and wealth, he, like all castrati, lived with the permanent physical and psychological consequences of his childhood sacrifice. His story, while one of dazzling success, is also a poignant reminder of the human cost behind the heavenly voices. The shocking secret of Farinelli is not just his talent, but the entire system, social, medical, and artistic, that produced such a figure, a god of song forged in a crucible of pain and extraordinary vocal discipline. His voice, now silenced, remains a symbol of a unique and uniquely troubling era in musical history. The golden age of castrati, roughly from the late 17th to the late 18th century, was not just a period of sublime artistry. It was also an era of fierce rivalries, colossal egos, and diva-like behavior that would make a modern pop star blush. While you, the listener, might imagine these angelic voices existing in a realm of pure musical devotion, the shocking secret is that the world of castrato superstars was often a cutthroat arena of intense competition for fame, fortune, and the adoration of the public. These were the original male divas, and their onstage and offstage antics were the stuff of legend. Imagine the opera houses of Naples, Venice, Rome, or London, the epicenters of this musical craze. Several top-tier castrati might be active at any given time, each with their own legions of devoted fans and equally passionate detractors. The competition for leading roles in new operas by famous composers like Handel, Scarlatti, or Hesse was intense. Impresarios and opera house managers would vie to secure the services of the most celebrated singers, offering exorbitant fees and lavish perks. You can picture the backstage intrigue, the maneuvering for a better aria, a more prominent position on stage, or a more spectacular costume. One of the most legendary rivalries was between Farinelli and Francesco Bernardi, known as Senesino, another hugely popular castrato. When both were performing in London in the 1730s, their respective supporters would form opposing factions, sometimes leading to near riots in the opera house. Their duels on stage, where each would try to outdo the other with increasingly dazzling vocal pyrotechnics, were legendary. Another famous castrato, Gaetano Majorano, known as Caffarelli, a student of Porpora, like Farinelli, was notorious for his arrogant, quarrelsome, and often outrageous behavior. He was known to insult composers, demand rewrites of his arias, and even engage in actual duels. One quirky tidbit: Caffarelli once reportedly sang an aria to a rival singer from the stage with such contemptuous brilliance that the rival fainted. This was high-stakes, high-drama stuff. The medical hardship here is less physical and more psychological. The immense pressure to maintain vocal perfection, the constant fear of a rival eclipsing you, the insecurity that often accompanies great fame. These singers, despite their often effeminate appearance and altered bodies, were frequently figures of immense masculine pride and professional jealousy when it came to their art. Their status as neither man nor woman in some social respects perhaps fueled an even greater need to assert their dominance and superiority on stage. The scholarly debate explores how much of this diva behavior was genuine temperament and how much was a carefully cultivated stage persona, a way of maintaining their superstar mystique and commanding higher fees. The human endurance required to navigate this competitive shark tank, while also dealing with the unique personal challenges of being a castrato, was considerable. They were often isolated figures despite their public adoration, their lives a strange mixture of artistic triumph and personal ambiguity. The shocking secret is that beneath the sublime beauty of their voices and the glittering spectacle of Baroque opera, there was a fiercely competitive, often petty and intensely human world of ambition, jealousy, and the relentless pursuit of operatic supremacy. These heavenly voices were housed in very earthly and often very temperamental vessels. The journey of a castrato from a hopeful village boy to an acclaimed opera star was almost invariably navigated through a complex and often exploitative system of patronage. In an era before modern agents or recording contracts, a singer's career, especially one as unique and potentially lucrative as a castrato's, depended heavily on the support and control of wealthy and powerful individuals, nobles, cardinals, kings, and rich merchants. As you, the observer, look behind the curtain of the castrato's public triumphs, a shocking secret of this dependency and the potential for manipulation it entailed comes into view. Imagine a young castrato, his voice just beginning to mature into its extraordinary potential after years of grueling conservatory training. He needs opportunities to perform, to be heard, to build a reputation. This is where patrons came in. A powerful nobleman or a high-ranking church official might take a promising young musico under his wing, providing him with further education, living expenses, and most importantly, access to influential composers, librettists, and opera house managers. In return, the castrato became, in essence, a prized possession, a living symbol of his patron's wealth, taste, and cultural influence. You can almost see the invisible strings of obligation and control. This patronage system could be beneficial, offering security and career advancement that would otherwise be impossible. Farinelli's long and incredibly influential tenure at the Spanish court is a prime example of a mutually, though asymmetrically beneficial, patron-artist relationship. However, the system was also rife with the potential for exploitation. The castrato, often from a poor background, and having undergone an irreversible physical alteration at his family's behest, was in a uniquely vulnerable position. His entire identity and livelihood were tied to his voice and his patron's favor. He might be subjected to the whims, demands, and even the abuse of his protector. The medical hardship here could be the psychological stress of this constant dependency, the fear of falling out of favor, or the pressure to perform even when ill or exhausted. Contracts between castrati and impresarios, opera managers, were often complex and could be highly restrictive. A singer might be bound to a particular theater or city for years, with limited control over the roles he sang or the conditions under which he worked. While star castrati could command enormous fees, a significant portion of their earnings might go to their patrons, their original music masters, or even back to their families who had made that initial, terrible investment. The scholarly debate often examines the degree of agency these singers truly possessed. Were they astute businessmen managing their own careers, or were they, for all their fame, still essentially indentured servants? Their unique talent, a double-edged sword that brought them glory, but also kept them in a gilded cage. One quirky, or rather revealing detail, is the way Castrati often cultivated relationships with multiple powerful figures, playing a delicate game of diplomacy and flattery to maintain their position and security. They had to be not just great singers, but also skilled courtiers. The human endurance required to navigate these treacherous social and political waters, to maintain a public persona of artistic brilliance while dealing with private anxieties and dependencies, was immense. The shocking secret of the Castrato's world is that even at the height of their fame, even when adored by millions and showered with riches, their lives were often not entirely their own. They were extraordinary talents, yes, but they were also products of a system that, while celebrating their voices, often treated them as valuable and ultimately expendable commodities in the high-stakes business of Baroque art and entertainment. The Castrati, with their unique physiology and ethereal voices, occupied a strange and often ambiguous space in European society. They were men, yet their bodies retained certain childlike or androgynous characteristics due to the prepubertal castration. They were lauded for their artistry, yet often viewed with a mixture of fascination, pity, and sometimes even revulsion or fear. As you, the observer, try to understand their personal lives, a shocking secret of profound emotional complexity, of love sought and often denied, of deep loneliness, and of navigating a world that had no clear category for their third gender identity, begins to emerge. Romance and relationships for Castrati were, as you might imagine, fraught with complications. While they were often the objects of intense adoration, even obsession, from female and sometimes male admirers, forming lasting, intimate partnerships was challenging. Marriage, for a Castrato, was a particularly contentious issue. The Catholic Church, which ironically benefited greatly from their voices in its choirs, generally forbade Castrati from marrying, as the primary purpose of marriage was considered procreation, which they were incapable of. A few Castrati did marry, sometimes secretly or with special dispensations, but these unions were often controversial and could lead to social scandal or ecclesiastical censure. You can imagine the medical hardship here being less about physical ailment and more about the societal and religious doctrines that impacted their ability to form families. Despite these obstacles, many Castrati did experience love and companionship. There are numerous accounts of passionate affairs, often with women of high social standing, who were perhaps drawn to their fame, their artistic sensitivity, or even the safe, i.e., non-procreative nature of a relationship with them. Some of these relationships were fleeting, others more enduring. However, the societal perception of Castrati as being not quite men often colored these interactions, leading to heartbreak, exploitation, or the relationships being conducted in the shadows. The human endurance required to seek and maintain love in such a complex social and personal landscape must have been immense. The question of their sexual identity and experience is one of the most debated and, due to the historical distance and lack of explicit personal testimonies, one of the most opaque aspects of their lives. Did the castration eliminate libido? Most contemporary and modern medical understanding suggests not entirely. Testosterone is also produced by the adrenal glands, and libido is complex, However, their sexual function and experience would undoubtedly have been different. They were often portrayed in satirical or hostile literature as either effeminate and asexual, or as decadent and sexually ambiguous figures. This public scrutiny and stereotyping must have added another layer of difficulty to their personal lives. One quirky, or rather poignant, detail is that some castrati formed deep, lifelong friendships with each other, perhaps finding in their shared, unique experience a level of understanding and camaraderie they couldn't find elsewhere. They were a small, exclusive, and often isolated brotherhood. The scholarly debate continues on how castrati themselves perceived their identity. Did they see themselves as a third sex, as some contemporaries described them? Did they grieve the masculinity that was taken from them? Or did they find a unique strength and identity in their artistry and their altered state? The shocking secret is that there was likely no single answer. Each castrato would have navigated his unique existence, his loves, his losses, and his sense of self in his own way, often in a world that struggled to understand or fully accept him, despite showering him with applause for his heavenly voice. Their loneliness, even amidst adulation, is a haunting undercurrent to their glittering careers. The adulation showered upon the great castrati was undeniably for their extraordinary vocal artistry. Audiences were genuinely moved, thrilled, and transported by the power and beauty of their singing. However, as you, the discerning observer of this historical phenomenon, look closer, you uncover a more unsettling, shocking secret lurking beneath the surface of this artistic appreciation. A current of morbid curiosity, a fascination with their altered bodies and unique status that sometimes veered uncomfortably close to a freak show spectacle. The medical hardship of their creation became, for some, part of the perverse allure. Imagine yourself in an 18th century opera house. The castrato star makes his grand entrance, resplendent in elaborate costume. The applause is thunderous, but as he sings, you notice the whispers in the audience, the exchanged glances. The opera glasses drain not just on his face as he delivers a moving aria, but perhaps with a more prurient interest on his physique, his mannerisms, searching for telltale signs of his unique condition. While his voice was celebrated as angelic, his body was often a subject of intense and not always respectful scrutiny. Medical writers and early anthropologists of the time sometimes discussed castrati in almost clinical detached terms, describing their physical characteristics, their height, their lack of beard, the quality of their skin, their altered skeletal structure, as if they were biological curiosities rather than complex human beings and supreme artists. This objectification, this treating of them as medical specimens, was a subtle but pervasive aspect of their experience. You can almost feel the discomfort of being constantly observed, analyzed, and categorized as other. Satirists and caricaturists of the era often targeted castrati, exaggerating their androgynous features, mocking their high voices when off stage, or hinting at their supposed effeminacy or sexual ambiguity. These portrayals, while sometimes humorous to contemporary audiences, contributed to a climate where castrati could be seen as figures of ridicule as much as objects of admiration. One quirky, or rather disturbing detail is that there were even public anatomical dissections or discussions of castrati after their deaths, furthering this sense of them being subjects of scientific or morbid curiosity. The scholarly debate considers how much this freak show element contributed to their fame. Did the whiff of the forbidden, the transgressive nature of their physical alteration, add a frisson of excitement for audiences, an element of the exotic and the unnatural that enhanced their mystique? It's a difficult question, but it's hard to deny that their unique status set them apart in a way that went beyond just their vocal talent. The human endurance required to navigate this constant objectification, to maintain dignity and professionalism while being subjected to such intense and often invasive public scrutiny, must have been enormous. The shocking secret here is the uncomfortable duality of their existence. They were revered as gods of song, yet simultaneously viewed by some as less than fully men, as curiosities, as products of a strange and unsettling medical intervention. Their lives were a constant performance, not just on the opera stage, but in every public interaction, as they navigated a world that was both captivated and discomfited by their very being. This underlying current of voyeurism adds a dark and complex layer to the glittering story of the Castrati. You've journeyed through the creation, training, fame, and complex social world of the Castrati art. But the central enigma, the shocking secret that tantalizes and frustrates musicologists and history lovers alike, is the sound itself. What did those legendary heavenly voices truly sound like in their prime? We have the music written for them, florid, demanding arias by Handel, Hasse, Porpora, Mozart. But the actual timbre, the unique quality of sound produced by these surgically altered male singers, is largely lost to time, a ghostly echo in the halls of music history. Contemporary accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries are filled with rapturous, almost hyperbolic descriptions. Writers struggled to find words to capture the experience of hearing a great castrato. You read phrases like voice of an angel, silvery trumpet, flute-like purity combined with heroic power. They speak of astonishing agility, breathtaking breath control, allowing for incredibly long musical phrases, and an emotional range that could move audiences from ecstatic joy to profound sorrow. Charles Burney, the 18th century music historian, wrote extensively of Farinelli, describing his voice as so powerful, so extensive, so various, that it vanquished all competition. These descriptions paint a picture of a vocal phenomenon unlike anything commonly heard today. The medical hardship that created them, the pre-pubertal castration preventing laryngeal growth, combined with adult male lung development and rigorous training, resulted in this unique instrument. They possessed, as we've discussed, the high range of a boy soprano or female mezzo-soprano, but with a power, projection, and stamina that most female singers or male falsettists of the era simply couldn't match, especially in the large unamplified opera houses. Their ability to execute dazzling coloratura, rapid scales, trills, and ornaments was legendary. Composers, knowing these capabilities, wrote music specifically designed to showcase this virtuosity, pushing the boundaries of vocal technique. The scholarly debate often involves trying to reconstruct this lost sound. Musicologists analyze the scores, study the contemporary descriptions, and even use computer modeling. But can we ever truly know? There is one tantalizing, if deeply imperfect, piece of auditory evidence. A series of recordings made between 1902 and 1904 of Alessandro Moreschi, often referred to as the last castrato. Moreschi, 1858 to 1922, was a singer in the Sistine Chapel choir. one of the final holdouts of the castrato tradition. You can listen to these recordings today, scratchy, primitive by modern standards, capturing a voice that is undeniably high-pitched, somewhat ethereal, yet also, to many ears, a little strange, even unsettling. One quirky, or rather crucial, detail about the Moreschi recordings is that they are highly controversial as a representation of the castrato voice in its golden age. Moreschi was in his mid-40s, arguably past his vocal prime. The recording technology was in its infancy and could not capture the full richness or power of a voice. Furthermore, the musical style he was singing, late 19th throughout early 20th century sacred music, was very different from the Baroque opera arias for which castrati like Farinelli were famous. Many argue that Moreschi's recordings, while historically significant, offer only a flawed, distorted glimpse of what those legendary voices might have sounded like at their peak. The shocking secret, then, is that the true sound of the castrati, the very essence of their art, remains an elusive ghost, a heavenly voice we can read about, dream about, but perhaps never fully, authentically hear again. For nearly 2 centuries, the castrati reigned supreme on the European operatic and sacred music stages. Their heavenly voices, the pinnacle of vocal artistry. But no artistic fashion, however dominant, lasts forever. As you, the observer of history, trace the arc of this extraordinary phenomenon, you arrive at the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a period of profound societal and artistic change that would lead to the gradual decline and eventual disappearance of the castrato. The shocking secret here is not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow unmaking, a fading away of a tradition that had once seemed unassailable. One of the primary drivers of this decline was a fundamental shift in musical taste and aesthetic ideals, largely influenced by the Enlightenment and the burgeoning Romantic movement. The highly ornamented, virtuosic style of Baroque opera seria, the castrato's natural habitat, began to seem old-fashioned and artificial to audiences increasingly drawn to more natural, emotionally direct forms of expression. Composers like Gluck began to reform opera, seeking greater dramatic realism and simpler, more direct vocal lines. Mozart, while still writing some roles that could be sung by castrati, like Idamante in Idomeneo or Sesto in La Clemenza di Tito, was also instrumental in elevating the status of other voice types, particularly the tenor, as the heroic male lead. You can almost hear the operatic landscape changing, the spotlight slowly moving away from the castrato. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, natural law, and individual human rights, also cast an increasingly critical eye on the brutal childhood sacrifice that created the castrati. The practice of castration for musical purposes, always clandestine and morally ambiguous, began to be seen by more and more people as barbaric, a cruel violation of human dignity. Philosophers and social reformers spoke out against it. The medical hardship inflicted on these boys, once perhaps tacitly accepted as a necessary price for artistic glory, now seemed increasingly indefensible. This growing ethical discomfort made it harder for families to make that terrible choice, and for society to openly celebrate its products. The French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars also played a significant role. Napoleon, a figure who embodied many Enlightenment ideals, at least in his early reforming phase, was reportedly repulsed by the castrato tradition. When French forces occupied Italy, they actively sought to suppress the practice. Laws were enacted making castration a serious crime. and the conservatories that had been the training grounds for castrati either closed or shifted their focus. This political and legal pressure dealt a severe blow to the already waning tradition. One quirky, or rather telling detail, is the concurrent rise of female sopranos as the dominant stars of the operatic stage. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, while castrati ruled, women were often restricted in their public performances. But as social norms evolved, and as the ethical objections to castrati grew, female singers with powerful, agile voices increasingly took over the heroic and virtuosic roles previously associated with male sopranos and altos. The prima donna began to eclipse the primo uomo, the lead castrato. The scholarly debate considers the complex interplay of these musical, ethical, and social factors in the castrato's decline. It wasn't one thing, but a perfect storm of changing sensibilities. The shocking secret is that the angelic voices, once so sought after, gradually became relics of a bygone era, their unique sound replaced by new vocal ideals, their creation deemed an unacceptable price for art. The decline of the castrati, as you've seen, was a gradual process driven by shifting musical tastes and evolving ethical sensibilities throughout the latter half of the 18th century. However, a specific series of historical events at the turn of the 19th century delivered a more decisive, almost fatal blow to this already waning tradition: the French Revolution, and more directly, the Napoleonic conquest and administration of Italy. As you, the observer, witness these geopolitical upheavals, you see how the actions of one powerful man, Napoleon Bonaparte, helped to accelerate the silencing of these heavenly voices. When French revolutionary armies, and later Napoleon's forces, swept through the Italian peninsula in the late 1790s and early 1800s, they brought with them not just military occupation, but also the legal and social ideals of the French Revolution, which were heavily influenced by Enlightenment thought. These ideals emphasized natural rights, individual liberty, and a rejection of what were seen as barbaric or superstitious practices of the Ancien Regime. The brutal childhood sacrifice that created castrati fell squarely into this category. You can imagine the French administrators, imbued with revolutionary fervor and a sense of enlightened superiority, looking upon the castrato tradition with disdain and outright condemnation. Napoleon himself, though an admirer of Italian music and opera, reportedly found the practice of castration for singing abhorrent. Under French rule and influence in various parts of Italy, new laws were enacted that explicitly banned the procedure, imposing severe penalties on those who performed it and on families who consented. While castration had always been technically illegal and condemned by the Church, these new Napoleonic laws were enforced with greater secular vigor. The clandestine networks of barbers, village surgeons, and music masters who had performed the operations for centuries found their activities curtailed or driven even deeper into the shadows, making the medical hardship and risk for anyone still attempting it even greater. The famous Neapolitan conservatories, the hothouses that had trained generations of castrati, also came under pressure. French administrative reforms often sought to secularize and modernize education, and these ancient musical institutions, with their traditional, often church-influenced methods and their reliance on a steady supply of castrated boys, were either closed, reformed, or saw their funding and student intake drastically altered. The entire infrastructure that had supported the castrato phenomenon for nearly 2 centuries, began to crumble. One quirky detail is that even as the practice was being suppressed, some older, established castrati continued to perform and were still admired. But the pipeline of new young talent was effectively being shut off. The scholarly debate often considers the true impact of Napoleon's decrees versus the broader societal shifts that were already underway. Were Napoleon's laws the primary cause of the castrati's final demise, or did they simply hasten an inevitable decline driven by changing artistic tastes and moral sensibilities? Most historians agree it was a combination. The Enlightenment had laid the groundwork for ethical objections. Musical styles were evolving, but the Napoleonic occupation and its legal reforms provided a decisive, empire-wide push that made the continuation of the practice virtually impossible on any significant scale. The shocking secret here is how a military and political conquest could have such a direct and profound impact on an artistic tradition. The human endurance of the Castrato phenomenon, which had weathered changing fashions and moral qualms for so long, finally met an administrative and legal force it could not overcome. The last generation of great castrati, figures like Giovanni Battista Velluti, who even performed in London as late as 1825 to mixed and often hostile reviews, were effectively the end of a line. Their voices, once the sound of an era, began to fade into history, a process accelerated by the Napoleonic reordering of Europe. You have journeyed through the entire arc of the Castrato phenomenon, from the desperate family choices and the brutal childhood sacrifice, through the grueling training, the dazzling operatic stardom, the complex personal lives, and the eventual decline and disappearance of these unique singers. Now, as you recline in the quiet of your own modern world, it's impossible not to confront the profound ethical questions that hang heavy over this entire historical episode. This is perhaps the most shocking secret of all. Not a hidden fact, but an enduring moral quandary. Was the sublime art created by these heavenly voices worth the human price paid for it? From our 21st century perspective, informed by ideals of bodily autonomy, children's rights, and a deep aversion to physical mutilation for non-medical reasons, the practice of castrating young boys to preserve their singing voices seems unequivocally barbaric, a horrifying abuse. You try to imagine any society today tolerating, let alone celebrating, such a practice. The medical hardship inflicted, the pain, the risk of death, the lifelong physical and psychological consequences feels utterly indefensible when weighed against the pursuit of an aesthetic ideal, however beautiful. Yet to fully understand the Castrato phenomenon, we must also try, however difficult it may be, to view it within its own historical and cultural context. In the 17th and 18th century Italy, particularly among impoverished families, life choices were often starkly limited. The prospect of a son becoming a famous castrato offered not just a path out of crushing poverty for the entire family, but also access to a world of education, culture, and social mobility that would otherwise be unimaginable. Was it an act of cynical exploitation by parents, or a desperate gamble born of love and a desire for a better future, however misguided by our standards? The scholarly debate continues to explore these complex motivations. And what of the art itself? The music written for castrati by composers like Handel, Vivaldi, Scarlatti, Gluck, and even Mozart represents some of homage to the most glorious achievements of the Baroque and early classical periods. These were not minor novelty pieces, They were often the dramatic and emotional centerpieces of operas and sacred works. The castrato voice, with its unique combination of power, agility, and ethereal beauty, inspired these composers to push the boundaries of vocal writing, creating music of extraordinary technical difficulty and profound expressive depth. Can we, or should we, separate this incredible artistic legacy from the morally repugnant practice that made it possible? This is the human endurance question for us as modern listeners and appreciators of history and art. How do we ethically engage with art born from suffering? One quirky, or rather deeply unsettling consideration is the role of the Church. While officially condemning the act of castration, the papal choir in the Sistine Chapel employed castrati for centuries, right up until the early 20th century with Alessandro Moreschi. This institutional hypocrisy highlights the complex and often contradictory moral landscape of the time. The shocking secret is that for many, the beauty of the music and the glory it brought to God or to the opera house seemingly overshadowed, or at least allowed for a collective turning of a blind eye to the brutal reality of its origins. There are no easy answers to these ethical questions. The story of the castrati forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between art and morality, between genius and exploitation, between cultural norms and universal human rights. It's a dark and fascinating chapter in the history of music, a reminder that even the most heavenly voices can sometimes emerge from a profoundly earthly and deeply troubling human sacrifice. As you drift towards sleep, these questions might linger, a somber counterpoint to the imagined beauty of those lost voices. The era of the castrati, those male sopranos and altos forged by brutal childhood sacrifice, eventually faded into history, their unique voices silenced by changing tastes, ethical awakenings, and legal prohibitions. Yet, as you, the observer, trace the echoes of this extraordinary phenomenon into our own time, you discover a shocking secret of artistic immortality. While the singers themselves are gone, the magnificent music written specifically for their unparalleled vocal capabilities endures. A rich, challenging, and often breathtakingly beautiful repertoire that continues to be performed and cherished today. Imagine the sheer volume of music composed during the 17th and 18th centuries, the golden age of opera seria and late Baroque sacred music. A huge portion of this repertoire, particularly the heroic male lead roles, primo uomo in operas, and many demanding alto and soprano parts in oratorios and cantatas, were written with the specific vocal characteristics of castrati in mind. Composers like George Friedrich Handel, Alessandro Scarlatti, Nicola Porpora, himself a renowned teacher of castrati, Johann Adolf Hasse, Christoph Willibald Gluck, and even a young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, all wrote significant roles for these star singers. You can almost feel the collaborative energy, the composer tailoring an aria to showcase the specific strengths of a Farinelli, a Senesino, or a Caffarelli, their astonishing range, their legendary breath control, their dazzling coloratura. This music, full of soaring melodies, intricate ornamentation, and profound emotional depth, did not simply disappear when the last castrati left the stage. It presents a fascinating challenge to modern performers. How do you bring this demanding repertoire to life without the unique vocal instrument for which it was conceived? The medical hardship of the castrato's creation is a historical fact, but the artistic product remains. The primary solution today lies with the two main voice types, female mezzo-sopranos or contraltos, and male countertenors. Female singers, particularly those with powerful lower registers and agile techniques, often take on castrato roles in modern opera productions. Their voices can approximate the range and brilliance required, and they bring their own unique dramatic interpretations to these historically male characters. You might see a Handel opera today where the heroic Julius Caesar or the valiant Rinaldo is portrayed and sung by a woman. This trouser role tradition has a long history in opera. More recently, the rise of the male countertenor has offered another compelling way to approach this music. Countertenors are adult male singers who, through specialized training, not surgery, cultivate their falsetto register to sing in the alto or even soprano range. While the timbre and physiological production of a countertenor voice are different from that of a castrato, lacking the same childlike laryngeal structure combined with adult male lung power, highly skilled countertenors can achieve remarkable feats of agility and beauty, offering a different, yet often very moving interpretation of this repertoire. The scholarly debate often compares the merits and historical authenticity of these different modern vocal approaches. One quirky tidbit is that some of the most famous opera arias still beloved today, like Handel's Lasciacio Bianca from Rinaldo or Ombra mai fu, Largo from Circe, were originally written for castrati. Their enduring popularity is a testament to the quality of the music itself, music that transcends the controversial nature of its original interpreters. The shocking secret, then, is that the legacy of this brutal childhood sacrifice is not just one of horror and ethical dilemmas, but also one of profound and lasting musical beauty. A repertoire that continues to challenge and inspire performers and audiences alike. A ghostly echo of those heavenly voices in our modern concert halls and opera houses. Our journey through the glittering yet deeply shadowed world of the castrati now draws to its inevitable close. You have heard the whispers of their heavenly voices, confronted the stark reality of the brutal childhood sacrifice that forged them, witnessed their dazzling ascent to operatic superstardom, and pondered the complex, often lonely, existence they navigated. From the desperate choices of impoverished families to the demanding discipline of the Neapolitan conservatories, from the adulation of European courts to the eventual fading of their unique tradition, the story of the castrati is a profound and often unsettling chapter in the history of music and humanity. The shocking secrets you've uncovered are many. The church's ambivalent role, the crude and dangerous nature of the castration itself, the unique physiological transformations these boys endured, the intense rivalries and exploitation that often accompanied their fame, and the almost complete disappearance of their true, unadulterated sound, save for a few ghostly recordings. You've considered the medical hardship, not just of the initial surgery, but of life lived in an altered body, under constant scrutiny, and you've marveled at the incredible human endurance required to survive the knife, to master an incredibly demanding art form, and to carve out a life in a world that both idolized and othered them. As you now allow the images of candlelit opera stages, shadowy back alleys where desperate bargains were struck, and the haunting faces of these unique singers to soften and recede, let the complexities of their story settle gently in your mind. This was a world where the pursuit of sublime beauty intersected with acts of profound physical violence, where art and cruelty were inextricably, tragically intertwined. There are no easy judgments to be made from the comfort of our modern perspective, only a deep and perhaps unsettling recognition of the strange paths human culture can sometimes take. The castrati are gone. Their specific, unearthly sound, which once held Europe spellbound, is silenced forever. But their legacy lingers in the glorious music that was written for them, in the questions their story forces us to ask about art, ethics, and the price of perfection, and in the enduring human fascination with voices. Let these lingering echoes now become a soft, distant lullaby. The passion, the pain, the glory, all are now part of the silent symphony of the past. There is only the peace of this moment, the gentle rhythm of your own breath, the quiet invitation to let go and drift into a deep, untroubled, and restorative sleep.